Whether your company is in growth mode, protecting what they have on hand, or adapting to a new normal, responsible expense management is never far from an executive's mind. This is particularly true during an economic downturn when the cash generated from expense reductions can be invested in growing your competitive advantage or as an alternative to more drastic action. My name is Philip Ideson, and in this special 5-part Art of Procurement series, I'll share with you the strategies and tactics that you can use to responsibly build the expense management program that your organization needs and achieve cost savings that stick. We'll consider how to build an expense management program, pitfalls to avoid, and the 24 different expense reduction tactics that you can use along the way. I'll be bringing my own personal experience from achieving hundreds of millions of dollars of savings as a practitioner and consultant over the last 20 years in a way that always focused on aligning outcomes with stakeholder and with company needs. Today, in part 3 of this 5-part series, I share 8 different cost reduction tactics that you can use with your incumbent suppliers or as part of a quick turnaround sourcing activity. So you now have your wave plan of project opportunities, but how do you know which expense reduction tactics you can use to actually maximize savings while minimizing the time to value for each one of the initiatives? The toolbox of tactics really available to procurement professionals can be captured really in 3 different areas. Today, in part 3 of this podcast series, we're going to talk about incumbent supplier tactics and sourcing tactics. Then tomorrow in part 4, we'll look at demand management and category management tactics. And then in part 5, the end of the week, is general tactics, which is a little bit of a catch-all for everything else. So let's talk about incumbent supplier tactics. And really that's reducing the cost of products and services that you buy with your existing supplier. And I have 6 different tactics to share. So the first one is renegotiate or restructure existing contracts. So changes in market conditions might actually enable you to renegotiate existing contracts. In return for that, one of the things I've seen effective is actually giving contract extensions as well, so that there may not be an impact on the total contract value. But if you're going from a 1 to a 2 year or a 2 to a 4 year or whatever it may be, having the same total contract value is something that is something that is valued, by your service provider, that you could offer for in return. You also have termination for convenience clauses that enable renegotiation, but I would hesitate that these should really only be used judiciously, for providers who are true commodity providers where you don't really have a relationship to speak of and the switching costs are really low. Now, the next tactic is to reduce the cost to serve. So a lot of the time, the actions that we take as the buyers often actually increase the cost for a provider to serve us. And obviously, at the end of the day, those expenses get priced in and we pay the price. So an example could be, we often overspecify the KPIs that we want. An example that I had in the call center space was, where you have a phone call that you have a KPI that the phone needs to be picked up 99% of the time within 3 rings. Does it really matter if it is picked up 99% of the time within 3 rings or 95% of the time within 3 rings, for example? Well, it may not really matter to you, but the service provider, they have to really build an entirely different staffing model to make sure that they can hit the KPI at 99% of the time versus 95% of the time. So you can make small changes that make big impacts on the cost to serve from the provider perspective. Another example would be to reduce payment terms. And I know that's kind of the opposite of a lot of what goes on a lot of times, but oftentimes when you have long payment terms, providers are going to increase their price to you by more than the cost of capital for floating you for the additional days, for any payment days over 30. So, you may have, 60 or 90 payment day terms. They're going to make sure that cost of capital plus some is priced in, where they have the pricing power to do that. Reduce their payment terms may give you the ability to take some of that cost back out. There's actually programs that you can use that will do this on a dynamic basis. Technology providers that you can use to look at this if you want to do this on a more programmatic basis. But speak to your suppliers and ask them if there's any ways that you can help them reduce their cost to serve without impacting the desired outcomes. The next tactic is something that is really born out of the manufacturing industry. It's something that I did a lot within the automotive business, more in direct procurement than in indirect procurement, to be honest. But I think it's just as valid in both spaces. And that's what we called VAVE, so value analysis or value engineering. These initiatives are collaborations between you and your supplier to really re-engineer a product or a service delivery model. They do require multidisciplinary support across both companies and an agreement up front as to how any benefits will be shared. So you're going to start looking into, a little bit of that reducing cost to serve that we talked about before, but should we be re-engineering something? If it's product-based, are there different raw materials that can be used? Or are we, do we have too rigid process requirements? From a services perspective, oftentimes we tell the supplier how we want to buy. This is the scope, this is the spec. So are there things that we can look at that which don't change the outcome? And how can we start to engineer that into the service that they provide and, reduce those costs? Now, I talked about and they require agreement as to how benefits will be shared. This has to be equitable for both sides because there's going to be workload on both sides to actually make it happen. The benefit for you is that, your supplier can share ways in which you can achieve the same or improved outcomes in a more cost-effective way. And the benefit for them, any new ideas can be applied to other clients, most likely in a way where they retain most, if not all, of the derived benefit. A next tactic, which is building on the VAVE, is reducing the scope of work. We talked about reducing scope in the value analysis, value engineering, just because you want to drive the same outcome. But what if you don't really need to drive those same outcomes? Maybe you don't need everything that's in your existing scope of work. So you can renegotiate based on a new reduced scope. Now, an area where I've seen this is, for example, where you have a minimum volume commitments. And those minimum volume commitments may have been built upon, for example, the number of employees you have. Now, in times like these, your employee numbers may not be what they were and perhaps not what you anticipated in the contract. So reducing scope could be, trying to reduce the minimum volume commitment that you have to make. Now, as you look at that, think about the flip side, what's in it for the provider. Well, consider building in triggers that then incrementally increase the scope back up to the original agreement over time. And that can be based on employee numbers or revenue or, whatever's the most appropriate for the product or service in question. Why is this important? Because it helps build trust. It helps the service provider truly understand that you're being genuine in your request and that you are willing to re-increase the scope as business hopefully turns around. I've had instances where I've had providers come to me with these kind of requests using justifications that didn't turn out to be true, and that just damages the relationships for the long term. Now, the next supply tactic you could use with your incumbent is actually help them negotiate with some of their tier 2 suppliers. So there's a couple of ways to do this. In some industries, and this goes back to manufacturing, you might actually direct your supplier to use a certain tier 2 supplier. And I've never personally been a fan of this model, as it absolves your supplier of responsibility for any quality or price issues. Hey, if there's a problem, you told us that we should use them. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get involved with tier 2 suppliers because they may use materials or have input costs. And again, this can be both product or services where you're actually able to leverage your scale and contacts to negotiate a more competitive price than they can get alone. So in doing so, they can pass all those savings along to you through the negotiation that you have helped them basically execute on. But for them, they get to take advantage of that reduced input cost, again, with some of their other clients. So it's a win-win situation. And then the last incumbent supplier tactic is related to inventory, for the reduction or reassignment of inventory. So for stock products, for example, MRO, carrying high levels of inventory can have a really high effect on your cash flow. So consider reducing the minimum on-hand quantities, or at the point of time where you actually take ownership of the inventory. There's things that you can do that are pretty creative with your providers, that may help you from a cash flow perspective. But just remember that whoever bears the risk of being stuck with unused inventory usually prices that into their commercial model. Also, if you lessen your inventory levels, you're going to need to increase your awareness and visibility into supply chain disruptions and shortages. Okay, so the next area of tactics, I'm going to share a couple of tactics related to sourcing. And honestly, a lot of the tactics that you can use can fall under the sourcing bucket, if you will. So I'm just going to really talk specifically when it comes to sourcing about going to market, and thinking about going to market, first of all, for commodity items, looking at something like an e-auction. So e-auctions, they've got a bad reputation over the years, often because they've been used and abused. And I could tell you a long story. I'm going to keep it short, but I once inherited a category where the use of an e-auction had driven up prices rather than reduced them. What happened is that it was a category that I inherited, fortunately. They'd gone to market to 3 or 4 different providers. This is in the early days of using e-auctions. But the incumbent supplier knew that they were really the only realistic source. They knew that these suppliers that we'd put in there, one was a kind of a random supplier in the Dominican Republic. And this was for a highly specialized product. There was no way that we would switch. And they knew that. And so they increased their price. So I say that just to say that, you have to be really careful about your use. When is the most appropriate time to use in the auction? But what they are is a really quick way to do market price discovery and secure some savings where you have those more commodity type products and services and you have the low switching costs. So again, going back to kind of my experience that I just shared, just make sure that a truly competitive market exists and you have the ability and the commitment, and this is really important, to actually switch suppliers if that's the ultimate outcome of the e-auction. You use it once as a price discovery tool, but nothing else changes. You're going to find it hard to go back to that same well again. And run other e-auctions, and word's going to get out that you're not really serious. So the folks who you invite aren't necessarily going to put everything they can into providing you the most competitive price possible. The second tactic related to sourcing, again, is going to market, but this is for contracts within 12 months of expiration. So the route to market for more complex products and services, is usually the trusty RFP. We often wait, not necessarily to the last minute, but when you may have 3 or 6 months left on the contract to go back to market, so that you're lining everything up so you sign the new contract, just as your old contract expires. Maybe there's a month or 2 either way of that, but that's generally how the timeline goes. Now, when you're looking at your wave plan, you can actually look for contracts within 12, even 14 months of expiration and actually go to market now, because if your incumbent wins the RFP, you can actually make your award contingent upon the new deal being effective from the time of the award, i.e. now, rather than wait for the original contract expiration date, which may be in 12 months' time. And if you select a new supplier partner, you're going to have time to fully implement the new contract, so you can take advantage of the new agreement on day one, and they may even incent you in different ways to bring them on board sooner. You can look at a dual sourcing situation, for example, for a period of time to really enable a smooth transformation while getting the benefits of the new pricing from the new RFP. So those are just a couple away from a sourcing perspective. Now, I want to thank you for listening to part 3 of this special series, Expense Management, Achieving Cost Savings That Stick. I'm going to be back tomorrow to start sharing some more tactics that can use, particularly in the category of demand management and category management. Thanks for listening to this Art of Procurement special series. For more information and for templates and cheat sheets that you can use to help drive savings that stick, we've created a free-to-access expense management hub that is powered by AOP Mastermind. For more information about the Expense Management Hub, go to artofprocurement.com/expense hub. That's artofprocurement.com/expense hub.